The silence inside the royal household shattered with one decision no one around Camilla expected to hear. A court had ordered a sealed collection of Diana's private letters opened, including correspondence that had remained locked away for years after an effort to keep it beyond public and royal scrutiny. Camilla did not receive time to prepare. The papers were opened, the names were visible, and suddenly, a chapter everyone thought had been buried was alive again. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla stared at the first page of the ruling as two senior aides waited across from her. The court order, a formal legal decision directing how protected material must be handled, had rejected the attempt to keep the collection permanently restricted. She read the same paragraph twice, lowered the paper, and asked in a voice stripped of warmth, "Exactly what have they opened?" Neither aide answered quickly, because everyone understood why the letters mattered. Diana had written them during one of the most painful periods of her marriage, when trust inside the household was breaking down and private conversations carried enormous consequences. The correspondence did not simply contain memories. It recorded her fears about who was influencing decisions around her, who she trusted, and why she believed certain relationships had become impossible to repair. That made the archive, a protected collection of historical papers kept for preservation, far more dangerous than sentimental notes. Charles received the legal summary separately and immediately understood the emotional force behind it. The king removed his glasses, placed them beside the document, and said nothing for several seconds. He knew Diana's words were not returning as distant history. They were entering the present, where William, Camilla, and he would all have to face them again. Camilla's fear sharpened when an aide pointed to one particular envelope listed in the inventory. A handwritten notation said Diana wanted its contents preserved even if others later demanded their destruction. The queen consort went still. That single sentence suggested the princess had expected resistance and deliberately created a record strong enough to survive it. Then came the detail nobody in the room wanted to deliver. Several letters referred to private conversations involving Camilla by name, and William had already been informed that his mother's handwriting appeared throughout the newly opened material. The future king was no longer standing outside an old dispute. The court order had opened the archive, but the real shock was only beginning. Diana had preserved memories someone feared, and William was about to discover exactly why. For William, this was never going to feel like an archive dispute. The moment Diana's handwriting appeared before him, titles, protocol, and royal strategy became almost meaningless. These were the words of his mother, written during years he had experienced as a child, but never fully understood as a man. And now, decades later, the future king faced something painful. Diana had left behind explanations that the family had never given him themselves. William held the reproduced page without speaking. The archive, a protected collection where historically important papers are preserved, had suddenly become personal, because the prince was not only Diana's eldest son, but also the man expected to protect the monarchy's future. That responsibility now cut in two directions. Defending the institution meant facing what its past had done to his mother, while ignoring those truths could damage the very future he was expected to safeguard. Camilla faced a different kind of danger. Years of public acceptance had slowly transformed her place beside Charles, but Diana's letters came from a time when wounds were raw and judgments were unforgiving. The queen consort understood that one handwritten page could drag an old emotional triangle straight into the modern reign. Her fear was not only what Diana had written, it was what William might feel when he read it. William recognized his mother's handwriting before he finished the first line. His expression tightened, and he quietly asked everyone except one trusted aide to leave. Then the future king kept reading. One passage described Diana believing that decisions about her future were being discussed in rooms she could not enter, leaving her convinced that exclusion was not accidental but deliberate. Charles learned through a private briefing that his son had begun reading the material alone. The king walked toward William's room, slowed outside the closed door, then stopped. He knew entering without invitation could turn grief into confrontation. After several seconds, the monarch turned away, carrying the painful knowledge that Diana's account was reaching their son before he had found the courage to explain his own. William soon reached another passage that changed the weight of the entire archive. Diana described a conversation involving Camilla that disturbed her so deeply, she wrote down her recollection immediately afterward and sent a copy to a trusted recipient for safekeeping. The prince reread the passage, then asked his aide where that copy had gone. The answer led backward, not forward. The court battle had not truly begun with lawyers or recent filings. It began with one forgotten encounter years earlier, when someone discovered that Diana's preserved account had been treated differently from everything around it. To understand why those pages reached a courtroom at all, the story had to return to the private exchange that turned an old royal archive into a legal time bomb. Years before the courtroom doors opened, one quiet meeting changed the fate of Diana's letters. There were no cameras, no palace announcement, and no dramatic confrontation. There was simply a former custodian of private royal correspondence, an archive inventory, and one instruction that did not feel right. A sealed packet carrying Diana's handwriting had been marked for additional restriction. But when the custodian asked why, the answer was so unusual that the conversation was remembered word for word. Eleanor Harcourt knew the difference between privacy and disappearance. After Diana's death, her personal correspondence had been divided among private recipients, family holdings, and protected archival collections. An archive review, a formal check of old records to decide whether restrictions are still necessary, was supposed to reassess material over time. Sensitive letters could remain closed to protect living people, but one bundle kept receiving exceptional treatment long after similar papers had been catalogued normally. The Eleanor felt the tension sharpen during a fictional 2019 review at Windsor. The retired records custodian was handed an authorization form, extending restrictions on a packet of Diana's letters indefinitely. She held the pen above the signature line and asked who had requested it. The answer stopped her. The instruction had come through Camilla's private office. Harcourt did not sign. Instead, she asked why this particular packet needed protection without an end date. Memory made the decision harder. Eleanor recalled Diana personally delivering sensitive correspondence years earlier and telling her that certain pages had to survive because memory becomes vulnerable when powerful people become uncomfortable. Harcourt had never forgotten the warning. Now, faced with a request that seemed to confirm the princess's fear, she quietly copied the archive reference numbers before leaving the review. Camilla learned through an internal documented account that Eleanor had refused authorization. The Queen Consort demanded to know why a records employee had challenged a sensitive instruction coming through her office. Her reaction exposed how personal the issue had become. She was no longer defending routine privacy alone. She wanted that specific packet kept closed. Eleanor retired with the reference numbers still preserved in her notes. Years later, lawyers seeking access used those numbers to establish that the letters existed and had been treated differently from surrounding material. Court filings then uncovered a chain of communications showing repeated attempts to delay access. They did not explain every motive, but they confirmed that Camilla's office knew exactly which Diana letters were causing concern. Camilla understood the danger the moment she learned Harcourt's records had survived. Privacy was no longer the central question. A paper trail now connected her directly to the effort to keep Diana's words sealed. And when William saw that trail, he no longer wanted statements from lawyers or explanations passed through aides. He wanted Camilla in the same room, with the documents between them, answering him face to face. William does not shout when he enters the room. That is what makes the encounter more unsettling. Camilla is already seated. Charles is there too, but the future king barely looks toward his father. He places the court papers between them, pulls out a chair, and asks the question nobody inside the palace can soften with protocol. If Diana wanted these letters preserved, why had Camilla's office spent years helping keep them closed? William had demanded this meeting after reading the archive trail. No communications secretary, no legal advisor, No prepared statement would speak for anyone. The archive instruction, a formal record telling custodians how historical material must be handled, sat between them because it linked Camilla's office to repeated requests for restriction. The prince wanted answers from the people who had shaped the silence. Charles stayed because he could not escape the center of it. Diana had been his former wife, Camilla was his queen, and William was the son carrying that history into the monarchy's future. The king understood that one wrong sentence could widen fractures he had spent decades trying to contain, yet saying nothing now would look like another form of protection. William slid the 2019 instruction across the table. Camilla looked down, but did not touch it. His voice remained controlled when he asked, "Why was my mother's own account treated like something dangerous?" The queen consort answered that reopening deeply private correspondence could wound Charles, William, Harry, and the stability rebuilt over years. He listened, then said, protecting people from pain was not the same as choosing which parts of a dead woman's voice were allowed to survive. Camilla finally admitted what she had avoided saying. Through the documented archive correspondence, she already knew several letters referred directly to her, and fear of Diana's words had influenced her push for restriction. She had not acted from institutional caution alone. Personal dread had entered the decision, and everyone knew it in that moment. Charles then spoke. He told William he had known some Diana material carried access limits, but he had never authorized permanent suppression of the specific packet named by the court. She turned toward him, realizing his words had drawn a line between what he knew and what her office had done. William rose with his anger still controlled, but no longer uncertain. If Charles had not approved the strongest restriction, then the question had changed completely. The next battle was no longer about memory, it was about authority, how much power Camilla had used on her own, and whether she would be allowed to keep any control over Diana's archive from this moment forward. The confrontation ends, but Charles remains behind. For several seconds, neither he nor Camilla speaks. Then the king reaches for the archive file William left on the table and begins reading the restriction history himself. What happens next is quieter than an argument and far more damaging. Charles realizes the court has already removed one layer of control. He must now decide whether the palace will keep fighting or finally stop resisting Diana's words. Charles reads every line again after Camilla briefly leaves the room. The royal household's legal posture, simply the official position its lawyers choose to take in a case, still matters even after the court has ordered the letters unsealed. The palace can cooperate fully, or it can keep challenging details and trying to narrow access. That means the monarch still holds enormous power over what happens next, and he knows any choice will be seen as personal. Silence makes the weight heavier. Charles stops at the section describing the 2019 restriction and presses his fingers against his forehead. He is not only judging an administrative decision, he is a husband examining an action taken by his current wife against the preserved words of his former wife. Diana is gone, but the consequences of that old pain are sitting directly in front of him. Camilla returns with one final request. She asks him to appeal the broadest part of the ruling, arguing that unrestricted scrutiny could reopen wounds for William, Harry, and the entire family. Charles listens without interruption. Then the king tells her he will not use the crown's resources merely to keep Diana's correspondence buried, because its contents might embarrass or hurt them. The decision lands with brutal calm. Charles instructs the household's legal team, through a written internal directive, to cooperate with the court and withdraw any remaining discretionary objections, based only on reputational discomfort. A discretionary objection means a challenge the palace is allowed to make, but is not legally required to pursue. He makes clear that genuine privacy concerns can still be reviewed, but fear of public judgment will no longer be enough. Camilla realizes the worst is still coming. Charles tells her that her private office will be temporarily removed from all decisions involving Diana-related archival material. Oversight will pass to a neutral records team, until every restriction has been examined independently. The Queen Consort asks whether he believes she cannot be trusted. He does not answer immediately, and the pause wounds more deeply than a direct accusation. By evening, Camilla understands what the order truly means. The documents she once influenced will now move forward without her approval, and Charles has placed the authority of the crown between her and Diana's words. The institutional battle is over. Now the personal consequences begin, because losing control of the archive is about to force Camilla to face what she feared those letters might actually say. For years, Camilla had survived public judgment by refusing to let old history control the present. But that discipline cracks when an aide arrives with a new access schedule for Diana's letters. There is no request for Camilla's permission, no space for negotiation. The pages will be reviewed under the court's order, and her office will receive only the same formal notifications as everyone else. For the first time, the machinery moves without her. Camilla reads the revised protocol twice before setting it down. The neutral review team, an independent group assigned to examine records without taking instructions from the people directly involved, now controls the process Charles authorized. Every restriction on Diana's correspondence will be separated into two categories: genuine privacy concerns involving living people, and limits based mainly on embarrassment, reputation, or fear of public reaction. That difference matters, because the second category can no longer keep a letter sealed. The Queen Consort reaches the line, removing her office from approval authority, and stops. Her advisors may still submit factual concerns, but they cannot block a document simply because it mentions her or challenges the accepted version of royal history. She closes the folder with deliberate care, thanks the aide, and dismisses everyone. Only after the door shuts does the control finally break. Years of discipline collapse into one frightening realization: she no longer has influence over what comes next. Charles finds her alone later that day. Camilla tells him she spent years building a life that was not permanently measured against Diana, and now she fears a collection of old letters could erase everything she rebuilt. The king listens without interrupting. Then he tells her that controlling an archive could never guarantee forgiveness, because acceptance built on silence was always vulnerable to the moment that silence ended. The review team soon sends Charles a documented assessment identifying one letter as especially sensitive. Diana describes discovering that a conversation about the future of her marriage had taken place before she was told what had been discussed. Her words carry anger, but also something deeper: the pain of realizing other people appeared to understand her future before she did. Another page unsettles the king for a different reason. Diana acknowledges that Charles himself seemed trapped between personal desire, public duty, and expectations he could not easily escape. She does not excuse him, but neither does she reduce him to a villain. The complexity makes the letters harder to dismiss and harder to weaponize. William receives those passages through the same formal review process and reads them slowly. Instead of growing angrier, the future king begins to see that his mother may not have preserved these words simply to condemn someone. She preserved them because she wanted the full emotional truth to survive. That realization changes everything, and it leads William to ask Charles for one private conversation with no advisors, no legal papers, and no monarchy standing between father and son. There are no aides in the room when William sits across from Charles, no legal folders, no private secretaries. For once, neither man is speaking as king or future king. William has read enough of Diana's letters to understand that the past was messier than the simplified story everyone inherited. But understanding complexity is not the same as accepting silence. He tells his father that Diana deserved to have her words preserved, and that protecting the monarchy must never again mean editing its memory. William had asked for this meeting after reading several complete letters instead of selected extracts. The difference mattered. A preservation protocol, a formal set of rules designed to keep historical records intact and protected from personal interference, suddenly became more than an administrative issue. The prince had seen anger in Diana's words, but also affection, fear, doubt, and moments of sympathy. She was not writing a neat verdict for history. She was recording what pain felt like while she was living through it. The future king finally tells Charles what the pages have done to him. Reading his mother's handwriting made him feel like a child again, sensing that something inside the family was breaking, while adults around him chose careful words, or no words at all. William says the hardest part was not discovering that Diana had suffered. He already knew that. The hardest part was realizing how many explanations had existed while he and Harry were left to make sense of fragments. Charles does not defend himself immediately. The king admits, through this private conversation with his son, that silence became a survival strategy after Diana's death. He believed avoiding old battles would protect his children and spare them from choosing sides. Instead, the monarch now understands that silence sometimes forced them to build answers without him, leaving gaps where honesty should have been. William then makes one thing clear: he will not turn Diana's letters into a weapon against Camilla. The prince refuses both extremes, burying his mother's words or exploiting them to punish the queen consort. Every lawful page, he insists, should remain preserved in full context, so nobody can erase the uncomfortable parts or isolate the most damaging lines for revenge. Charles agrees. The king orders a permanent independent preservation protocol ensuring that no royal spouse, household office, or future monarch can quietly destroy or indefinitely restrict Diana's collection for personal reasons. William hears the decision and, for the first time since the archive opened, feels the conflict shift from accusation toward responsibility. But their private understanding cannot remain private for long. Word of the new protections reaches the public just as major excerpts begin circulating, and Diana's handwriting becomes the image Britain cannot stop looking at. By sunrise, the story no longer belongs to the courtroom or the palace. It belongs to millions of people staring at Diana's handwriting across newspapers, television screens, and phones. Yet the reaction is not simply fury at Camilla. Something deeper happens. The public sees the words of a woman who knew others might someday define her story for her, and who deliberately preserved her own version. For one extraordinary morning, royal history feels intensely personal again. Broadcasters quickly frame the ruling as a battle over memory, not simply another chapter in the old triangle involving Charles, Diana, and Camilla. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main official headquarters and the place from which major royal statements are often issued, releases a short response confirming cooperation with the court and Charles's new independent preservation rules. The statement does not attack Diana's letters, and it does not defend the earlier restrictions. That restraint matters, because the palace is no longer trying to control the emotional meaning of the documents. Camilla watches the coverage privately, as her role in the 2019 archive restriction is discussed again and again. The Queen Consort reaches one segment where commentators focus less on what Diana wrote and more on the effort to limit access to it. She switches off the television before the discussion ends. In that moment, the damage becomes painfully clear. Her greatest problem is no longer a sentence from the past. It is the fact that she tried to decide whether that sentence could ever be read. William feels something different. The prince sees a photograph of his mother's handwritten page reproduced publicly and does not react with anger. Instead, sadness settles over him. Words written during Diana's private pain have become national property overnight, studied by people who never knew her and interpreted by strangers. He understands why preservation matters, but he also feels the cost of seeing something intimate turned into public history. Outside Kensington Palace, emotion takes a physical form. Crowds begin leaving white roses near the gates, and one newspaper front page appears repeatedly in people's hands. Diana's handwriting reproduced beneath the words, "Let her words stand." Kensington Palace, the royal residence closely linked to the princess during her lifetime, becomes the emotional center of the public response. Then the mood begins to change. Fuller extracts show Diana as wounded and angry, but also uncertain, affectionate, and capable of seeing that several people around her were trapped by the same system. Charles is not reduced to one role. Camilla is not protected from responsibility, but neither is she turned into a simple symbol of evil. That complexity leaves the family with one final task. The public has reacted, the documents have survived, and the attempt to control them can no longer be denied. Now Charles, William, and Camilla must decide what accountability actually means. and whether truth can finally exist without being used as another weapon. In the end, the most important revelation is not a scandalous sentence hidden inside Diana's letters. It is the fact that those sentences survived it all. Camilla feared what the past might do to the life she had built. Charles feared reopening wounds he had spent decades trying to contain. William feared discovering truths about his mother that could never be unknowable again. Yet once the seal broke, all three were forced to accept the same reality. Memory cannot be healed by controlling it. The court's decision now stands, and the lawful letters remain unsealed under the review process already established. That process, the formal system deciding which historical documents may be accessed while protecting legitimate private information, permanently shields Diana's correspondence from destruction, selective disappearance, or renewed restriction, based only on royal embarrassment. The significance reaches beyond one family dispute. It creates a boundary between protecting genuine privacy and rewriting uncomfortable history. Charles formalizes that boundary through the independent archive protocol he agreed with William. The king makes clear that no royal spouse, household office, or future monarch can quietly decide which painful memories deserve to survive. Private sensitivity may justify careful handling, but personal discomfort cannot become a reason for erasure. For the monarchy, that lesson carries a painful price, because it arrives only after trust has already been damaged. Camilla meets Charles privately once the protocol is finalized. The queen consort admits during that conversation that fear pushed her further than she should have gone. She had spent years trying to escape Diana's shadow, and in doing so she tried to control something that had never belonged to her, another woman's own words. The king does not excuse the choice. He tells her plainly that it was wrong, but he refuses to turn accountability into humiliation. She accepts that rebuilding trust means living beside Diana's memory, rather than trying to weaken it. William chooses something harder than revenge. The prince makes clear to his father that the letters will never become ammunition in a campaign against Camilla. His mother's voice will remain intact, including the painful passages, the compassionate ones, and the contradictions that prove she was human rather than a perfect symbol. William returns one reproduced letter to its protective folder and closes it gently. Then the future king looks toward Charles and says, "She does not need us to rewrite it. She only needed us not to erase it." His father gives a quiet nod. That is where the battle finally ends. Camilla loses control of Diana's archive. Charles chooses transparency over protection, and William protects memory without turning it into a weapon. Diana's words remain alive, preserved, and beyond anyone's power to bury again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.